Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marc Engel, and Mike, Neary, and I are going to bring up the rear with the last presentation of the day. We're going to try to draw some through lines between a lot of the information that was discussed earlier. Our topic is smart strategies for hiring, managing, and retaining talent with a particular focus on mitigating risk. So Mike's going to talk about hiring issues. He's going to talk about performance management. And he's also going to talk about keeping your best folks. And then I'm going to go ahead and follow up with strategies for retention and some best practices going forward. So without further ado, we turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark. And can everybody hear me out there? Okay, great. So I am going to talk a little bit to begin today about the hiring process, because I think if you get the hiring process right, you're really set up for success as an employer. And so I think what I like to do is break it down to the studs and really look at how my clients are finding the right talent out there and making sure that they are. Are we having technical difficulties before I keep going? Scott, are we okay? Okay. All right. When you begin the hiring, when you begin to think about hiring for a new position, I like to examine kind of what makes people succeed in those positions. So if it's a position that you've had that you're filling because you lost somebody, if you can do an exit interview with the people that left to try to get a sense of, why they're leaving, and do an interview with the managers who are overseeing that position to see maybe why that person didn't work out or why they were disappointed that they left, like what characteristics did that individual have that made them great and you were really sad to see them go. And from that fact gathering process, you can really start to develop a meaningful job description. So we just finished an AI presentation, and I'm sure the easiest thing to do in today's world is just to have artificial intelligence create a job description for your position or to refine your existing job description. But I think that's really a losing strategy, because the job description really is a way to find the right person, because when you have your interviewing team together, they're going to be judging the candidates off of what's necessary for that person to succeed in the position. So you really want to drill down and try to be specific rather than just general as to what this position is going to require the person to do. So rather than saying things like you're a strong communicator, you might want to say you need to lead a weekly meeting and you need to report to upper management the results of that meeting within a specific time period. So you're having more detail in that job description that can help you find a good person. It can allow that person that's applying for the job to figure out if, this is a job that they want or they can succeed at. And also those job descriptions really do help minimize some legal risk as you bring people on board. So when you think about some common scenarios that employers are dealing with and people are calling me about to work through, one of the big ones is the remote work. Someone has a disability or has an issue come up and they want to work remote, or you're trying to bring them back and they want to work remotely. Oftentimes, people that I'm dealing with, they're screaming that you have to be in the office to do this job. And so I gather the job description and it says nothing about that. So that's really just an example of a way that you can really minimize your legal risk with the appropriate job description that really aligns with what's necessary for that position. So once you have a solid job description, you're ready to kind of go out to market. I really encourage folks to think through the pipelines with which they're looking and marketing their positions. Because if you're just going to the same well, trying to find the cousin of, your chief executive officer or chief revenue officer, you're really diminishing the talent pool that you can bring to the table. And particularly with the environment that we're in right now, where any efforts to kind of highlight and particularly target certain groups are going to be under potential regulatory scrutiny. Expanding the pipelines with which you're searching for candidates can really help you maintain a diverse workforce, which I think studies have shown, enhances the decision-making process for businesses. So while efforts to specifically target and bring on board individuals in certain categories or protected categories is going to be subject to regulatory scrutiny, expanding the pipeline can really help you find a diverse workforce, and it's going to allow your folks that when they get on boarded with you are going to find a community that's welcoming and that they can then are set up for success once you bring them on board. The other thing to think about in the hiring process to be able to bring forward strong, successful employees is your application process. In today's world, people are applying for jobs on their phones, attention spans. I always joke with my kids that the more time they spend on social media, the shorter their attention span gets. You need to think about that because that's the candidates that you're bringing in. So I really encourage you to really streamline your application process, make sure it's mobile friendly, and make sure that it's not going to be taking somebody 45 minutes to get through their application process, because I think you're going to be losing some of the good and successful hires if you don't do that. The other thing to think about as you're interviewing people is you want to have a structured team of individuals that are going to be doing the interviews, and you want to have thought through the questions that are going to be asked. Gone are the days where you should just be grabbing 5 people on the day of the interview and putting them in a room and just shooting the breeze with the candidates. That's really a recipe for disaster, because the individuals who don't get the job can bring forward employment claims. They can say that they, for just like when you fire somebody, not hiring somebody can give rise to an employment claim. And so you want to have trained individuals who are part of your interview team. You want to vet questions so that you're not allowing the people that are conducting the interviews to be asking inappropriate questions, nor do you want to have kind of the shoot from the hip interview, because then you're not evaluating candidates on an apples to apples comparison. I recommend kind of a rubric from which the interview team can come back from that interview and evaluate the candidates based on the questions that you ask that are hopefully standardized across the candidate pool, so that when the interview process is over and you're going to make your offer, you're having a concrete way in which you can make the selection, and then it's justifiable later. So if an individual doesn't get the job and they bring an employment claim, you're in a position to justify what you did, and you don't have to then explain why the person who never interviewed anybody asked some crazy questions, or the same questions didn't get asked to everybody that was brought forward through the process. So hopefully, if you make your hires and you bring people in the door, you've got some good talent. Now you really want to kind of think through how can we set up our folks to succeed within this organization. And I think at its basic level, performance management is really a tool to help people succeed. Hopefully, the only time that your employees are getting feedback is not at an annual review cycle. That is not a way in which individuals can really kind of course correct and grow in a position in any meaningful way, because a lot of times, if you're not giving that meaningful feedback in real time, by the time you get to the annual review point, managers have given up on people. Managers have, really kind of moved on already. They're at their wits' end. So I would encourage you all to really kind of embrace more of a real-time feedback process, which requires managers to kind of be trained on how to communicate with people in real time so that they know how to give constructive feedback. It's not really designed to be punitive. It's not designed to dump on people. It should be an opportunity to highlight strengths, highlight what people are doing well, what's appreciated, and also at the same time, point out instances where the employee has kind of missed the mark and give them kind of immediate feedback on how to improve in the future. Whether that's monthly, weekly, every other month, it really should be kind of more than once a year or twice a year. And I think training those managers to give that feedback consistently, and also to set the clear expectations on the front end about what managers really are looking for, which should be kind of baked into the job description. So that can really be the guiding piece of a lot of the conversations so that there's really no surprises. But the feedback process should not just kind of be vague, like you're not responsive enough. It really should be setting expectations that are clear, like I'm expecting you to get back to our clients within 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever it is. Even if it's not a substantive answer, if it's, hey, I got your message, I'm underwater at the moment, I'll get back to you soon. If that's the expectation, you should be clear about it and don't kind of speak in vague generalities that doesn't really allow the manager to come back and say, hey, look, you missed the mark. You didn't get back to somebody like I told you to. Because then the employee's really just kind of lost in trying to decipher what is a timely response. So when your managers are giving their feedback, as much as they possibly can, you want to try to tie it to objective measurements and avoid kind of subjective criteria. So to as much as possible, try to have objective things that are not really debatable. For instance, that 24-hour rule or whatever your rule is within your organization for getting things done. That's not subjective. Like the employee either hit the mark or didn't. So really encourage your managers when you're doing your training, when you're talking and trying to guide the managers on performance management, focus in on the objective outputs and really focusing in on that in those performance conversations. So that is kind of the building blocks of the performance management process. That's the easy stuff. Where it gets complicated, and Jim and Matt and Mason hit on this in their presentation, is when you have employees who have engaged in protected conduct. And how do you manage those employees? Because I think, as Jim mentioned, employees are smart nowadays, and if they're on thin ice and they're not performing, It doesn't take long for them to realize that if they make a complaint that they've been subject to discrimination or that there's some unlawful conduct going on at the company, they're putting themselves in a protected category. And smart, sophisticated employers know that that individual is now in the zone of protection for a period of time, where if you take an adverse employment action against that person, they are going to have a viable retaliation claim. Courts, I think, uniformly look at it like within 2 to 4 months of a protected action, there's in all likelihood going to be enough to support a viable retaliation claim. And so I was heartened to see that case that they highlighted where the court didn't think a jury trial was necessary when you were in that zone of protection, because the employer did a really good job of kind of documenting the performance issues along the way. But it's really necessary when you have someone who's engaged in protected conduct that you have the building blocks in place, that you've been following those in your performance management process before the complaint comes in. So a lot of times folks reach out to me when they have an employee who's underperforming, who's now engaged in protected conduct, and they want to, the employee continues not to perform. And the biggest question along the way is, how do we continue to demand that they meet our expectations without walking into a retaliation claim? And what I have, first I look back, what has happened to date, and hopefully there's been some documentation of poor performance before the protected conduct has happened, because that's great. That's going to be part of the story. If this continues to be in a posture where this employee is not performing and you have to move on from them. But one key way to move forward is to kind of bifurcate the performance management process with the handling of the protected complaint. So whether it's legal or HR that's going to be examining the complaint of wrongdoing, whether it's discrimination, harassment, whistleblowing, whatever it is, I would really kind of have a team dedicated to kind of running that to ground and investigating it, that's separate and apart from the managers who are managing the performance issues. And if the complaint's against the managers, you're going to have to act fast to figure out whether there needs to be kind of a course correction, whether there should be somebody else managing the day-to-day, depending on the nature of the complaint. But regardless of who is doing the managing, whether it remains the same manager or whether it's going to be somebody else, I would make sure that you have a separate group that's examining the protected complaint. And take it seriously, document your examination of the allegations. And if it comes back as unfounded, you want to document that. Jim made a good point about the thoroughness of the investigation. So if you're going to if you're in a tricky situation where you're dealing with an employee who's underperforming, who you may suspect has dumped this complaint on the table to protect themselves and give them longevity at your organization, don't jump to conclusions. If your view of the world is clouded by that, you probably want to bring in an outsider to examine that, because if this really goes off the rails and you end up in litigation over this, and you've got emails amongst your staff where everybody's rolling their eyes and everybody thinks this is all BS, you're not going to look like a really good investigator, a neutral person to have examined what they have alleged was wrong with the organization. So just keep that in mind when you're getting your team together to look at the protected conduct, and document the investigation, obviously, but continue to document the performance issues. I can't begin to tell you how many cases I've handled in the number of years I've been practicing law now, where the theme of the employment case is that the manager micromanaged me after I complained. And so that's why the building blocks are so important to deal with performance issues early and often in a professional and polite way, but you want to do that, have your building blocks in place, because inevitably, once the protected conduct comes in and the performance issues continue, the narrative that would be set by a plaintiff's attorney is that manager is now hyper scrutinizing me. They're over managing me, right? Everybody else here doesn't have these weekly meetings. Everybody else here doesn't get these emails once a month about their performance. So you want to be prepared and fight back against that by having your consistent process in place and really treat them the same as you would and you have been before the protected conduct comes in. And you want to be documenting it along the way, whether it's, if you're a really small shop, it's the emails to yourself, spoke with employee A on this date, we talked about X, Y, and Z. Now you've memorialized it. That's kind of the bare minimum that you want to be doing just to have a record of it. So when you have your really tricky situations, you do want to be kind of mindful of, before you reach the ultimate termination decision, if you can't get it back on track, of bringing in a set of eyes to really scrutinize and turn the cube over this, to really think through whether you've done enough and to protect yourself from that potential retaliation claim. Retaliation claims are the #1 claims. They're the easiest to get to a jury trial, which has been alluded to today. Employers don't want to be in a jury trial if they can avoid it. So whether it's, if you bring in counsel to kind of look at the documentation, really push on this to make sure that everything has been well documented and is consistent with your theme or your rationale of your performance reason. I think you would then be well positioned to move forward with your employment action if you need to take it. So the keys are, hire well, do it cautiously or thoughtfully, and then progressively manage people to give them every opportunity to succeed. Don't let things linger. Don't push it off to every 6 months, and train up your managers to have difficult conversations with people in a way that's professional and really designed to help them succeed, and not just dump on them as having failed you. And if you do those things, hopefully you'll be set up to have good, strong talent that Marc can now kind of walk through how we can retain them.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Awesome presentation. I'm going to amplify on some of the themes that Mike addressed, and also add some thoughts and comments on retention and best practices going forward. Mike used an expression that I use a lot: turn the cube over. I do that a lot. I use that expression a lot in my practice. By way of background, I spent the first half of my career litigating all sorts of disputes, all sorts of employment disputes, business disputes. The second half of my career, it occurred to me that most of the stuff that comes across my desk should never come across my desk. And how can I take the lessons that I learned litigating and apply them in a proactive way to get ahead of the curve and not be reactive? So that informs a lot of the comments I'm going to share with you today. And I have some, when you've been doing this for a minute or two, like some of us here have been, you have some themes and some theories and some philosophies about why people file claims. What causes this? Why are some companies seemingly not having claims filed against them? Why do some employees not file claims? Why in the same sort of fact pattern do you have one person run to a plaintiff's lawyer and another fact pattern, the employee moves on gracefully? And those things have occurred to me, and those patterns seem to repeat. So I'm going to try to share with you in a short amount of time some of those themes that I think are really important to keep in mind. To my mind, they're hugely important, because in my view, and again, this may sound a little, out of the box, a little different. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm huge on the fundamentals. I'm huge on the blocking and tackling of what it means to have good employment practices. And if you have that sound foundation, okay, and the employees perceive, and I'm going to keep coming back to that word, that you're trying to do the right thing as an employer, I think you get frequent flyer points for it. I really do. I haven't seen it quantified, but when you're in any kind of relationship, if you mess up and you take ownership of it and you try to fix it, what are your odds of that relationship or that problem careening out of control, right? They go down precipitously. So just something to keep in mind. So let me amplify one of the great comments that Mike made about the hiring process and the interview process. 1,000% I agree. I talk about this regularly. Almost all the roads in my experience, these personnel issues and employment issues at some level, not all, but many of them can be traced back to the hiring phase. Most people assume it's like death, taxes, and whatever. Okay, meatloaf on Tuesdays. It can't change. I can't do any better with my hiring. It's hard to find good employees, yada, yada, yada. I'm not subscribing to that. And I'm not going to buy into that. I think you can improve because I think success leaves clues. When I do manager workshop trainings for clients, I oftentimes ask them to take a sheet of paper and draw a line down the middle of the page. No names are the ground rules. Tell me the characteristics of the people who worked out at your organization and tell me the characteristics of the people who didn't. And you can't mention a name. And it takes 5 minutes. And I challenge you to try to do it. What do I hear? Somebody had initiative. They were collaborative. Okay. They were a good colleague. They were low maintenance, right? They had passion. They had fire in the belly. They cared. They were loyal. They were dedicated. And guess what? What do I see on the opposite side of the page? The opposite of that. They were narcissistic. Okay. They were self-centered. They were high maintenance. Okay. They were of the category of it's not my job. Okay. And those are the seeds that lead to hiring and performance management and ultimately claim problems. And ultimately, if you look further down the road, the folks who take 1,000 cuts, by social media. So I look at it not just from the claim perspective, I look at it as the brand proposition. Okay. What are we doing to guard and protect the brand? And as people in the HR world, people who are HR professionals, I think they have as part of their many responsibilities. That's part of it, if you ask me. Okay. The company or the organization has put out a mission statement. They have put out a set of values. They have gone ahead and manifested and represented to people that they want to hire that this is who we are. And HR is often charged with holding the line on that. And you play into 1 million different audiences. It's a really thankless job. So how do we improve it? One thing that Mike talked about is objectifying the hiring process. If you had 10 factors that you were going to base the hiring decision on, and somebody could get a maximum of a score of 50 because they could get a 5 on each of those 10 categories, then you could say credibly, I hired this person over that person because they scored a 42 and the other person got a 31. I think that's where Mike was going. Okay. But what kinds of questions am I asking? Am I going on social media? Am I going on some chat box and figuring out the best questions to ask, the most familiar questions to ask? Where did you work? Tell me about your experience. What did you like best about it? All good questions. Okay. I prefer a different set of questions. Okay. Such as your resume looks really awesome. What is it about yourself that doesn't come crashing through your resume that you think distinguishes you? Okay. Give me an example of a failure that you had that you learned from and grew from. If I hear that from a young associate at a law firm, okay, my chances of success just went up significantly. So again, sharpen the questions that you ask from an interview standpoint and from a reference standpoint. On references, you're going to get a lot of, I can only get name, rank, and serial number. Why? Because people like me and maybe Mike sometimes tell employers to be very careful what they say. Okay. But if you look hard enough, most people have references that are not bound to their former employer. They have a mentor, they have a friend, they have a clergy person, they have a professor, they have a teacher. Don't get blocked. Okay. Because if somebody says, I need a reference to get hired, like manna from heaven, they can appear. So what do I like to ask of the references? I like to ask relevant, in terms of relevant questions. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you assess this person's passion for their job? What would have made it a 10? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you assess this person's initiative? Okay. Can you give me an example when they went over and above what they were asked to do to contribute to a project? And if I hear somebody start the sentence with, Mark, let me tell you about the time, right? My chances for a good hire just went up. Okay. Job descriptions. Let me address that for a second. Job descriptions are awesome. I hugely believe in them. But I see a lot of them. They have 10 bullet points, right? But the candidate, the problem with job descriptions is the lack of alignment. Okay. If I have 10 points in a job description, and I'm thinking as an employer, I want that person to really have strong research skills, right? Because that's 50% of the job. And the candidate doesn't like doing research, but they figure it's 10% of the job. Okay. What are the chances of that hiring working out if that alignment doesn't exist at the outset? Okay. It's a prescription for a headache. So I often look at the job descriptions and I challenge my clients, use a pie chart metaphor instead. You're not going to get precise about it, and it's going to be fluid, but approximately, okay, and this is where the hard work comes in, roll up the sleeves. Where do you envision this person spending their time? Okay, 25% in research, 20% in writing, 20% in this, that, and the other thing, right? I'd rather have somebody tell me at the outset of the hiring process, thanks very much, but research isn't my thing. Okay, great, move on. All right. So again, there's a lot of good, important work that can be done at the outset. Dust off the job descriptions. Don't just add to them with bullet points. Really think about how this position fits in. Use that pie chart model. Okay. How do you see this position evolving? Get different stakeholders to have input into that process. Is it time consuming? Can it be challenging? 100%. But it becomes the roadmap for your evaluations. It becomes the roadmap for promotions. It becomes the roadmap for feedback, raises, and so forth. And it becomes your defining foundational work if you need to move on from somebody that didn't work out. Does that make sense? So again, do it upstream. Okay. It's not the most fun thing in the world. Okay. And you're going to get blocked as HR professionals because what? People want people hired either 3 months from now or 3 days ago, right? And sometimes the art and the finesse is slowing down that train, tapping the brakes. If you're not getting the references coming in and it's a condition of getting hired, tap the brakes. If people are blocking, I can't find anybody. People have read these articles on the internet. They get very clever, as Mike said, and Jim and others mentioned, about trying to hide the ball a little bit and to get this information. If you work hard enough at it, you'll get it. And if the red flags keep presenting, usually it's because there is really a red flag. Okay. Retention. What are people looking for in a job? Okay. One thing to keep in mind is look at your industry. Okay. Know your brand, know your organization. I can't tell you the last time a young associate asked me about how long it would take, how many years to partnership. Okay. Back in the day, as my daughter would say to me in 1492, everybody asked that question, right? Of a young associate, young associates. How long's the partnership track? Okay. The point of reference, the horizon is what? 18 months? 2 years? Okay. So again, what are we doing about that? Okay. How are we filling those positions? Are we looking at our business model and saying, you know what? It's okay if we replenish every 2 years. Okay. Or is that not okay? Because the opportunity costs are extraordinary. Okay. In doing so. Again, think about these questions and these positions differently. Okay. Is it going to be meaningful to the individual? What do I, as the employer, have to quote unquote sell that's going to make me the Uncola, that's going to make me show up different for an employee? Do I have an opportunity? Do I have professional growth? Do I have a sense of belonging? Do I have a community impact? Our friend Alan Gregerman, who's a friend of many of us, writes a lot about what people in different generations are looking for in a job. It's just not dollars and cents. Okay. There's great work out there by a couple of authors, Ethan Bernstein and Michael Horn, who have written two great articles that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. One is Why Employees Quit. If you'd like a copy, I'm happy to send it to you. There's now scientific sort of data research where they studied hundreds of folks to find out the pushes and pulls of why people stay and leave an organization. It's absolutely fascinating. Okay. And now there's data that supports that. Okay. And their idea is that you can weave that into your questioning and weave that into your job descriptions and weave that into what you're offering a candidate. They also wrote a shorter version of that article talking about 4 questions to ask. The secret to retaining the best employees. Ask them these 4 questions. And I thought this was inspired. Let me give full attribution to Mr. Bernstein, Ethan Bernstein, and Michael Horn. Number 1, at the end of an interview or a feedback or a review, when was the last time you almost quit? Really interesting question. Kind of scary question to ask, right? You got to know when to ask it and how to ask it and have the finesse to ask it, but read the article. The second question, when was the most recent time that work didn't feel like work? Right? In other words, people really enjoyed it. What's that going to tap into? What they really like to be doing. Aha, we ask them. We get frequent flyer points for showing that we care and we're trying to meet them where they are. Number 3, what trade-offs are you making to stay in this role? If someone has home care issues, if they have other kind of family commitments, if they're traveling an hour and a half, okay, what are those trade-offs? Is that something as an employer we can do something about? Does that mean that we go to a modified work schedule? Okay. Do we relax the start time? Do we relax the time that they have to leave? Okay. Number 4, if this job disappeared tomorrow, what would you choose to do next? I thought that was a brilliant question because it really is going to captivate how tied in these folks are to what you think they're doing. You may think this is the most important thing in their world. And if they say to you, gosh, if this job disappeared, I'd go back and get my teaching degree. Okay. Or I'd go back and I'd work in Oregon and I'd be a ranger. Okay. We now have insights into what people want. And from my perspective, the more we can tap into these questions about trying to meet employees where they are, ask them what we can do to make their experience better, the better our chances of retention. And if retention does not work out, right, the better our chances of having brand ambassadors out on the street that are going to be advocates for us. They're going to be referrals for us, for new hires, for clients and so forth, right? Because it appears that we care. Okay. So again, a different way of approaching the issue. So again, to my mind, these 4 questions devolve to really 2 basic questions. I see all these these surveys, employee surveys. How do you like the computers? How do you like AI? How do you like, this, that? I don't understand half of the technical stuff, which Mike will tell you, right? But I think they basically come down to 2 questions. Okay. And people look at me like I got 3 heads. Number 1, how happy are you here on a scale of 1 to 10? Right? And what could we at the firm do or the company do to make your experience a 10? Imagine if those 2 questions were asked and nothing else was ever asked in a survey, what kind of feedback or what kind of results you might have from employees. I think you might have a few employees that might need to go to the ER because they'll need to be resuscitated because they've never been asked that question. Okay. So my challenge to you is to take that really seriously because it matters. Why does it matter? Because when I have deposed people, when I've interviewed people, when I find out why people leave, why they quit, why they file claims, okay, why they move on, okay, usually they're moving away from something or they're moving towards something. And oftentimes what they're moving away from is a lack of respect. Okay, the quiet quitting, the quiet staying, the quiet, I'm almost out of here. Okay, I'm not fully engaged. What's wrong with that person? Gaslighting stuff that goes on at the employer level is oftentimes, in my experience, because there's not a perception from the employee that the employer actually cares about them. Okay, stunning to come from a management attorney to hear that. Okay. And I may get an earful from Jim after this, but I don't know, but maybe. But that's really what I believe. Okay. So how can we show up different? How can we, appear to these employees to be different, right? Employees, lawsuits and legal claims are like code hooks. They're about a lack of respect, and people are going to find a code hook. In other words, a legal theory that supports the lack of respect, wrongful termination, harassment, discrimination, whatever. Go through the whole litany line. What's the through line that connects all them? I got disrespected. Okay, because of my race, gender, disability, I was retaliated against. I wasn't taken seriously. I was micromanaged, as Mike said. When I complained about it, I wasn't given leave on time. Okay, and so forth and so on. It's about a lack of respect in most instances. Okay, the difference between why people leave employers, maybe annoyed, okay, but understanding, and run out to a plaintiff's lawyer or go on social media is oftentimes about respect. Okay, just a thought. Okay, as the commercial goes, not a sermon, just a thought. All right, 10 things that all employers should do regardless of size. And I'm going over my time a little bit and I'll try to be quick. But again, there's a myth that small employers don't have to be worried about these things and that the employment laws don't apply to them. There's a myth that the nonprofits don't have to worry about this stuff because the employment laws don't apply to them. No, wrong. Okay, for all intents and purposes, get that out of your head. Okay, so what are some concrete things that you can do tomorrow? Okay, that won't take a whole lot of time. Okay, update your employment documents. Others have talked about this. Update the handbooks if others have talked about it. Don't go on AI and borrow somebody else's, get some chat box version of this. You get what you pay for. Okay, update your job descriptions in the way that we talked about. Look at that as a pie chart. Okay, do they really work? Are they meaningful? Ask people, does it really align with what people are saying and doing on a day-to-day basis? Okay, and if not, correct it. Have we mischaracterized somebody as exempt or non-exempt? Really big issue. Okay, and the best thing to do, best advice I give to you is do that under the advice and counsel of Jim or Jesse or Mike or me or any of us, because you have a better chance of keeping that analysis privileged. Because if you find out, holy blank, I've been treating this person as exempt when they should be non-exempt, perhaps even more so with AI, how do we change that? How do we message that? How do we communicate that in an effective way that protects us? Okay. Centralize hiring decisions. Okay. Get the memo out, literally and figuratively, to folks who want to go ahead and think managers that they can go ahead and deliver news to employees. And uphold that strictly. Centralize the decisions to HR professionals and senior management. Train your managers, okay? And then train them some more. And when you think you're done training, bake training into every meeting that you have with them, even if it's 5 minutes. Do mock exercises of a mock review. Do an assessment of what the characteristics are of the people that worked out and didn't work out. Create a forum where they have a comfort level of coming forward, okay? Most mid-level managers, here's the inside baseball view from my perspective, is they're too embarrassed to ask for help. Okay, they don't want to seem stupid, okay, or foolish, and they don't want to seem like they don't know what they're doing, and they don't want to feel like they always have to ask for help. And therein lie the seeds for many of these retaliation claims, oftentimes not because somebody is overtly retaliating, but because the left doesn't know what the right's doing. Okay, and again, it promotes a culture, as one firm I know called the joy of mistakes, okay, where people can come forward and it comes out of the military and celebrate those mistakes and learn from them. Address performance problems early and consistently. We've talked about that. Anti-harassment training, it seems to have lost its place in the list of things we should be thinking about. I think that's a mistake. Okay, we still have harassment claims getting filed. Okay, even in the hybrid world, even in the remote world, super important for in and of itself, because it's important for harassment claims and because it's a metaphor for a larger form of manager training. Why do I say that? Because the principles of harassment training are in many respects the same principles for managing employees effectively. So the wink and the head fake is, if you're conducting this training, okay, you're communicating to employees that you care. And if you're doing it for managers, you're fortifying the manager training, okay? EPLI insurance. Look at the EPLI insurance with your agents and brokers and turn that over. Lori knows an awful lot about that. We have other folks at the firm, Jim, Mike, who have dealt with those issues. Okay, work with those folks to say, look, am I covered soup to nuts for the kinds of employment claims that I have? Do I have insurance if I'm relying on AI? I have no idea. Okay. Somebody much smarter than me can figure that out. If the insurance companies have even figured it out. Do I have insurance if my vendors that I'm working with in my hiring go ahead and ask an inappropriate question, right? I'm the principal, they're their agent. Do I have insurance for them, right? Ask those questions. Importantly, and perhaps most importantly, ask if you have coverage for wage and hour and overtime claims, because many of those policies that exist for EPLI have sublimits for wage and hour and overtime claims, meaning a much smaller amount, and sometimes they only cover defense costs. And many a client has had a wholly blank moment when they found that out. Okay, understand why your employees are leaving, conduct the interviews that we talked about. Okay, as I said, I think success leaves clues. Ask and make a study of why people have left, because it'll provide clues for keeping them there. Okay, practice authentic empathy. And let me just kind of end on this note. I wrote an article about it that some of you may have seen called "Why Successful Employers Understand That Empathy is Actually a Superpower." And I really believe that. So basically, it's not advocating for the lack of rules in the workplace, to the opposite. It's applying those rules consistently. But I talk in the article about a story that I heard on a podcast a number of years ago from a very acclaimed business owner, very, very famous, I won't mention his name, who was going out and reaching out to some employees who had been at the company for many, many years. And he went to one of the employees who had been with him for 30 years and worked in the warehouse and went to congratulate him. And he asked him, how was your experience? And the employee said something to him, said, it was fine. It was okay. And the employee said, every time I got a paycheck, this company had, my head, because I needed the money. This company could have had my heart if they had asked me how I was doing, how my family was, what I was concerned about, and how my experience here at the company could have been better. And so in my view, authentic empathy is really a superpower. I think it's a connective tissue for a lot of these issues that we're talking about. I think it's a differentiator between claims being filed and not being filed. And I think it's a superpower when it comes to retention. So thank you for your time.